Good afternoon. This is Chuck Coldwell. I'm with Pentegra Retirement Services, and today you've joined me to discuss the annual non-discrimination testing of your defined benefit plan. You participate in what we officially call the Defined Benefit Plan for Financial Institutions. It's a multiple employer plan created by the Federal Home Loan Banks back in 1943. And I should add before we go too much further here that this will be recorded. You will all get an email with a link in it so that you can review the presentation again. But today, I want to focus on something we don't focus a lot on, and that's non-discrimination testing under the Defined Benefit Pension Plan. You're probably all familiar with your 401k non-discrimination testing, which has to do with something we refer to as the ADP, average deferral percentage, and ACP, average contribution percentage testing that we do in the springtime for your 401k plan. This is a little different. This is a set of discrimination testing that we have to do for the pension plan that really encompasses a number of different tests. So as you can see here, when we start talking about non-discrimination testing for the pension plan, it's really 3 separate tests. And there can be various stages to each of these tests. So each year, we have to meet, all of our plans have to meet something called minimum participation, minimum coverage, and your non-discrimination tests. So all 3 have to be met in order to pass. And really what this boils down to, very similar to your 401k plan, is we're always looking at, does the plan discriminate in favor of highly compensated employees? That's what non-discrimination testing is all about. And as a definition, your highly compensated employees are generally defined as a 5% owner, or we use a gross compensation level, which currently is $120,000 gross comp. And that gross comp is always in the year prior to the testing. Or you can use an alternate definition using the top 20% of your employees by gross comp. So you can use either one of those definitions. And at the end of the day, what we're testing is both eligibility and the benefit levels or accrued benefits by both groups. I'm going to start for the next couple of slides giving you an overview of the process. And I think what's important to understand is your pension plan is a July 1 to June 30 plan year. Therefore, we use June 30, which is the last day of the plan year, to do the testing. And I added the bullet here about the valuation report only because that's important to understand. We send that out in October, which is the plan cost. And following that distribution is when we can do the first step of testing. So most of you should have received, all of you should have received, a communication from us last November, December, showing the first step of testing. Again, that was for June 30, 17. If a second step is required in order to pass these non-discrimination tests, that is when we fold in your 401k data, your benefits under the 401k plan. And that communication generally comes out in early April, following the completion of the 401k non-discrimination testing. The good news is most of our clients passed in the first step, and that would have been last November. And if you pass, the good news is you get to pass for the next 2 plan years. So for example, the last test we did was June 30, 17. If you passed, then you pass the rules and the tests for 3 plan years. The plan year ending June 30, 17, which was the test date, and the next 2 plan years. If you fail, then corrective action has to be taken on the following July 1. So that last bullet here shows you if your test fails June 30, 18, which will be the next testing date. The plan must take corrective action by July 1/19. And as we'll get into later in the program, we'll talk about what kind of corrective actions are possible. The issue is one of timing, because we may not know that you have failed a test until April. As an example, our next test will be June 30, 18, in a couple of weeks. We may not know if we have to fold in your 401k data. We may not know the results until early April of 19. If by folding in your 401k benefits you have still failed these tests, then action will have to be taken in just a few months following that July 1/19. So part of this whole reason for this kind of a communication, and we have this in your letters, in both the fall letter and the spring letter. If you fail, there's certain types of action you may have to take. And we want everyone to start thinking about those actionable items so that you know ahead of time that if and when you fail, what action you feel you can take. So let's take a look. We have a lot of plans that are soft frozen, which, for example, means you have picked a date and anyone hired after that date will be excluded. People hired prior to that date are still accruing benefits. That's a soft freeze. So what happens when you do a soft freeze? Well, you're not enrolling any new people, which means your group is shrinking. That can often lead to a failed test. The demographics of whatever covered group remains obviously changes as people terminate and retire. That can cause a failure in the future, a soft freeze. If you maintain more than one benefit structure, and many of our clients do, you have one structure for older employees, one for employees hired after a certain date, you may find that leads to failures in the future. Again, it all depends on the demographics being covered under each of the benefit structures. And certainly this is all about the two groups, highly compensated versus non-highly compensated employees. And therefore, the demographics of both of those groups drive results. And having a higher percentage of highly compensated employees generally can lead to failure of these tests. So let's go back to the beginning. We have to test a plan once a year. We do it on June 30, and we test each of these things. Minimum participation under IRS Code Section 401A26, minimum coverage under Section 410B, and non-discrimination under IRS Code 401A4. So those are the three broad tests. We'll start with minimum participation, and that is the easiest to understand of the three tests. It's fairly straightforward. Your plan must cover the lesser of 50 employees or 40% of your total employees, whichever is less. So as our example, if we had 200 bank employees, 40% of 200 is 80, 50 is less than 80, you must have at least 50 employees covered. And what happens over time? If I have a soft freeze where I'm excluding future hires, or I have several exclusions in my plan, the plans do allow certain categories of employees to be excluded altogether, like hourly paid employees. Depending on how many people you exclude, you could run the risk of not meeting these minimum numbers. So again, minimum participation is looking at the number of employees who participate. It's got to be 50 or 40% of the total, whichever is less. The second test is minimum coverage, and this is far more complicated. It has several stages to it. That's why we have to break it down into two communications for you, one in the fall and one in the spring. In the fall, what we're looking at is this ratio percentage test. And that's simply looking at the number or percentage of non-highly compensated employees who are benefiting from your plan versus the percentage of highly compensated employees benefiting. you don't have any exclusions and you don't have a soft freeze and everybody's participating, you're going to pass coverage. It's when you start limiting who participates that you may have an issue. So in the fall, we do this ratio test. If you pass the ratio test, you're done. We can go on and you don't even have to go to the spring results. It's if you fail the ratio test that we try to go on to the average benefits test. But the average benefits test has two parts: the non-discriminatory classification test and the average benefit participation test. And here's the key. If you have failed that ratio test up above, the second bullet for coverage, we try to go to the average benefits percentage test. But there's a step in between that you must pass in order to even look at the average benefits percentage test. And that's the non-discriminatory classification test. So let me spend a minute going through what that means. So again, we've gotten to this point because we have failed the ratio test for coverage, and we're looking at the next stage. So in order to pass this non-discriminatory classification test, there are 4 steps. And the first step is simply looking at the percentage of non-Hileys and Hileys who are benefiting under the plan. Again, if you have a soft freeze, there's a group of employees who are not benefiting at all. Then we determine the ratio. So I'm just trying to make this simple by saying in our ratio, we had 60% of non-Hileys who are benefiting, and we have 85% of Hileys who are benefiting under the program. Your ratio test then is 60 divided by 85, or 70.6, and that number will become important in a minute. That's the first step. Second step here is now we have to determine a non-highly compensated concentration percentage. So again, what that's looking at is the number of non-highly compensated employees that you have versus all non-excludable employees, and that's a percentage. And that percentage is used in conjunction with an IRS table, where we're looking at something known as safe harbor and unsafe harbor percentages. And that will allow us to determine whether you have met this concentration percentage test. And just without getting into too many details yet, if the ratio test, which was again looking at your non-Hileys who are benefiting versus your Hileys who are benefiting, if that percentage exceeds the safe harbor percentage, then you've passed and we can proceed on to the average benefit percentage test, where we're now going to roll in your 401k benefits. If it's less than the safe harbor percentage, but greater than the non-safe harbor percentage, then we have to look at facts and circumstances to determine whether we can proceed to the next step. And if that 70.6 were lower and it fell below the unsafe harbor percentage, you would fail coverage and have to take corrective action. Again, we'll talk about types of corrective action in a minute. So this slide now we've assumed we've been able to pass that non-classification test, and we can move on to the average benefits percentage test. This is the test that occurs in the springtime, March and April, where we have folded your 401k plan benefits into your pension benefits to look at a total benefit between non-Hileys and Hileys. One of the key elements of this, and that's what drives your timing, is the pension plan is a plan year that runs July 1 through June 30. So June 30 again is our testing date. In order to merge in the 401k data, we have to use calendar year data. So the last test we did was June 30, 17. We used calendar year 17 401k benefits for the testing. Again, we've got to complete our compliance testing on the 401k to know exactly the benefits that have been earned under 401k for the year. That's why April becomes the magical date. So what do? We are now going to combine, for purposes of minimum coverage, again, under this average benefits percentage test, we are now going to combine your accrued benefits under the pension with projected 401k benefits. And here's where this becomes a benefit, being able to roll this in, because we get to project 401k benefits to age 65. So that means if I'm 25 years old, we are projecting benefits over the next 40 years. And we can project employee pre-tax, Roth, and employer contributions at 8.5% interest to determine the account balance at age 65. And then we convert that account balance to an annuity and add it to this year's current accrued pension benefit. For each individual, we do that. Everybody who's non-highly, and we do it for all the highly compensated. One of the things that we also factored in is some of our clients have subsidized early retirement benefits, and the increased value of those benefits are reflected when we're doing this test. And ultimately, what we come up with is an average accrual rate for the highly compensated versus the non-highly compensated. And we compare those. So again, just for the purposes of this example, I simply said once we've combined both the pension and 401k benefits, I determine an average accrual rate for the non-highly compensated group. My example was 15%. Combining the benefits for highly compensated come out to 18%, and then we're looking at one as a ratio of the other. So 15 divided by 18 is 83.33% in our test case. It has to be at least 73.5. So in this case, we've passed the average benefit percentage test, which it therefore means we have passed coverage. And then we start to look at the third leg of this, which is now non-discrimination requirements. You've looked at participation, you've looked at coverage, now we have to look at something called non-discrimination requirements. And once again, this is all about not discriminating in favor of your highly compensated employees. Many of our clients have what is called a safe harbor design, which means we simply have one plan formula that applies to everybody. And if that is the case at your institution, then you have automatically passed non-discrimination. Where it starts to get a little more complicated is for clients that maintain multiple plan formulas and benefit structures, whereby now, for non-discrimination purposes, we have to test each of these structures separately. And each separate structure must pass minimum coverage. And if any structure fails, once again, we get to the bottom line conclusion, we got to take some action to correct and pass that test. So, for the last 5 or 6 slides, I've been trying to describe how this could work. And now what we're looking at here is an example of a client that has multiple components or plan structures. All right, we have 2 plan formulas in place. Participants hired before one date are getting one formula. Participants hired after another date are getting a different formula. So we now have to test each of those components individually. So in this example, you've seen how many total employees we have on line 1, 298, how many non-highlies and highlies, and then we have to look at each component by saying, okay, with component plan 1, how many benefiting employees do we have in that component? Well, I have 108. I have 106 in the second component. Within each component, we say how many non-highlies are benefiting and how many highlies. You can see the numbers there. And then for each component, we have to create these participation ratios. So line 7 for non-highlies in the first component says we have 43 non-highlies who are benefiting out of a total of 156, which is line 2, that was 27.56%. Same calculation for component 2. How many highlies do we have? Under the first component, we have 65 out of a total of 142, that's 45.7%. And likewise for the second component. Those percentages become important. Now we're going to compare those percentages to the threshold, a ratio test threshold on line 10. So line 9 is the key. We look at line 7 divided by line 8, the percentage of non-Hileys benefiting versus the Hileys that are benefiting, and plan component number 1 said that came out to 60.21%. That's less than the threshold, so that in and of itself right now does not pass. The second component did pass. The ratio of 7 versus 8 with 87.64, greater than the threshold of 73.5, that component passed. So there's one other thing that we can look at with the first component plan. It's if the ratio of 60.21 is greater than that safe midpoint of the safe and unsafe harbor, which the range was 50 to 40, and that came right from the IRS code. It's a table in the code. If it's greater than the midpoint of that safe, unsafe harbor percentage range, then you pass. So this one was at 60.21%, greater than 45. Then they both pass the average percentage test, and they have both passed coverage. So the question therefore is, once again, if you pass non-discrimination, then there's no action that needs to be taken. If you fail non-discrimination test, or if you fail coverage, or if you fail participation, then there's going to be corrective action that must be taken by the July 1 following the failure. So let's get to this point. And let me just, before I start talking about the corrective actions, let me just kind of summarize where we've been. We do the test once a year on June 30. If you pass a simple ratio test in the fall, you're done. We don't have to worry about it till the next year. If you haven't passed the ratio test, then we have to go back into, and hopefully we can get to, the average benefits percentage test. That's where we fold in your 401k data. The timing of that is generally early April to know whether you passed or failed. And this slide starts to get into, okay, we've done the testing, we've done all the legs of the stages of the testing, and we have failed one or more of these. So what happens if I fail minimum participation? That's where you don't have 50 or at least 40% of your total population participating. Well, there are not a whole lot of solutions. You can either add previously excluded participants to get you over that 50, or you're going to have to hard freeze the plan, which means there are no future benefit accruals. And we do have some plans today that are hard frozen. Still alive, they're still subject to actuarial evaluation results. They simply just have not been terminated, if you will. But once you get to a hard freeze, these minimum participation, coverage, and non-discrimination requirements no longer apply. What happens if I fail minimum coverage? Minimum coverage issues are simply a demographic issue where you have more highly compensated employees benefiting than is permitted. In order to solve that problem, you have a couple of avenues. You could add non-highly compensated employees who had been excluded to the plan. You could actually remove highly compensated employees, take them out of the plan. One of the things that you can also look, if you were to take highly compensated employees out of the program, is to look at non-qualified plans to make up some of the benefit, all of the benefit. One of the caveats I'll add is you might find that removing highly compensated, which probably isn't popular, but you probably cannot cover all of those highly compensated employees with a non-qualified plan. So that's further discussion would have to occur there. There is an alternate definition of highly compensated. Remember up front I said we generally look at a compensation level, $120,000 of gross comp. You could look at the top 20% of your population to determine highly compensated. Depending on the size of the organization, if it's a larger organization, that may shrink that population significantly and could have some favorable impacts. Or a combination of these things. Ultimately, a hard freeze is still a solution for minimum coverage failure. And then for non-discrimination requirements, that tends to come into play when I have multiple benefit structures at my organization. And certainly one way to cure a failure on the non-discrimination requirement is to go forward with a single benefit structure. As a matter of fact, that's something we did here at Pentegra not too long ago. We had several different benefit structures. We had a group of employees who was not covered by the plan, and we decided that we would cover everybody going forward at a lower level, but everybody got covered, and it also solved this non-discrimination issue. So let me add this as a conclusion. There's no way around this. This is very complicated. We test both 401k and pension plans every year. I would say that the pension non-discrimination testing is more complicated. It has more layers. Minimum participation, minimum coverage, and non-discrimination requirements are the three main tests, all of which have to be passed. Again, 6/30 has been our standard testing date. You can alternately test other dates besides the end of the plan year. If you were to do something of that nature, we have to bring in all the participants that terminated during the year, which is obviously an additional data collection, which is why we tend to test on the June 30. I would go back, after hearing this, I would go back and take a look at your probably November and April letters, just to reread them, to see that if they make a little bit more sense now. But here's the bottom line. If you have a plan that is soft frozen, or you have a plan that has multiple benefit structures, and again, soft freeze means you're not enrolling any new people, the potential failure is just a matter of time based on changing demographics. So what we want our clients to think about is what actions are we comfortable taking should we hit upon a failure? Does it make sense to add excluded employees to the plan? Does it make sense to have a single benefit structure rather than multiple benefit structures, even if it's at a lower level or even much lower level, in order to cover all employees and solve any non-discrimination issues? Because the issue we all have is one of timing. If there is a failure, we may not know the results of that failure until April. So let's use the next testing period. June 30, 18 is our next testing period. If you pass the ratio test, coverage test, and your minimum participation, we'll know that in November. And if you pass that, great, you're done. If you don't pass that, then we got to go on to the springtime testing, which is using your 401k benefits. And the timing there is, well, we've got to do compliance testing on the 401k plan first, so any refunds are due by March 15th. So we really can't look at this until following those tests, which means early April is when you're going to know whether you have failed or passed the June 30, 18 test. The worst case scenario is you failed, and you've got to take corrective action. The law requires that corrective action be in place by July 1, 19. So you've just learned in April of 19 you failed. July 1, 19 you have to have action in place to correct it. if you are reducing benefits or if you are eliminating people from coverage, there's notice requirements that have to go out ahead of time of that 7/1/19 effective date. If you've got more than 100 people, 100 participants, that's a 45-day notice requirement, which is now May 15th. Which means if you haven't thought about this and what kind of action you want to take ahead of time, you'll have between April, the first week in April and the middle of May, to make and finalize decisions. So we're trying to avoid that fire drill. We'd like our clients to think about it now, that upon failure, here's the steps I'm willing to take, A, B, and C, in that order. So that when you learn of a failure, you already know the plan of action that you want to take. It will just be a means of actually executing and communicating the change. So if you remember anything from this, remember that it's time to now think about your plan of action, and don't wait until you've actually learned of a failure to determine what level of action you want to take. At this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions. People can certainly email me afterwards. Again, this was Chuck Coldwell. I'm chuck.coldwell@pentegra.com from an email standpoint. But, I hope this has been at least a little bit clearer. It's a difficult subject matter. It is an important one, especially if you have a plan that is either or has either implemented a soft freeze or multiple benefit structures. At this point, I thank you for listening and appreciate your participation.